Foliage and architecture make great subjects to combine together in the one drawing, but it has its challenges. Now, most of the time when I draw trees and other foliage-based subjects with architecture, the architecture is the star event, and the foliage I often think of as a support act. Now, every element in our drawing needs to be drawn with the same care and consideration, although we don't necessarily draw everything in the same way. But we don't want any part of it to look careless. But I thought with this scene, what particularly appealed to me was that I felt that in this case, the architecture was the support act down the back, and this view through these large trees that were much closer to us really was what this scene was all about. And yet those stone blocks down the end of this pathway provide visually a great contrast to the foliage, and I thought would create the interest to the scene. I'm using a 0.1mm pen at this point just to give myself some guidelines with the various trees. Really important that we untangle the foliage when we have trees layered behind each other, overlapping each other, because even when the trees are different and even slightly different greens, the camera can flatten the effect and tend to group all the foliage together. So working out what trees what is important. And now I'm using a 0.3mm pen, which is the thickest pen that I'm using, to start to establish the final strokes for this closest tree on the left. Now, at this point, I'm still really exploring my marks as I go. What I am wanting, though, is that at the end of the drawing, that the different trees look like they're different trees. So I don't want to use a generic foliage pattern, if you like, that's going to be the same across all the foliage, because that will just make everything a big mass of lines. Now, there's going to be a lot of lines. There's going to be a lot of marks on the paper when I finish this, but I still want clarity as best I can manage it with all the marks that they read as different types of trees at different distances to us. So still working on this tree on the left. As you can see, I really basically draw trees by hatching. Switch now to a 0.2mm pen just to do the railing a bit further away, because I'm using a 0.2mm pen for the tree, or I will, for the tree right at the back that goes over the door of the church. Now back to the 0.3 and really trying to get a sense of what marks I'll use where we see leaves, particularly because this tree being quite close, we do get to see some leaves, but I can't afford to start drawing individual leaves because, well, that's just not practical, and I think visually it's not going to give me the effect I want, even if I was going to live long enough to do it. However, at this point, I'm also not trying to get my final marks, my final values being the lights and darks. So I know I'm going to come back to this tree and put more darkness into it. But the tree on the right-hand side has, I think, a lot more darker darks to it, and I'm going to make it a darker tree than the one on the left, because darker values tend to come forward, and this tree I want to come to feel closest to it. So I'm leaving the one on the left for now and to start working over this one on the right-hand side. So the silhouette edge of the tree canopies is important, and I'm trying to get a very different line with this one that reflects more this tree as opposed to the one on the other side of the pathway. This is sped up 2 3/4 times. So it's, in real life, it's taken me slightly under 1 hour, slightly under 60 minutes to draw. When we have a lot of foliage, it is a bit of a commitment, I think, to do well, depending partly what approach we're going to take. But I knew for what I was going to do it would take me some time. I knew there would be a lot of building up of values because I want there to be a contrast between all of the trees and the light stonework at the very back. That's going to be an important part. And even the trees in the far distance above the roofline, I want them to have some value so that they really stand out from the church, or rather the church stands out from the leaves. So I want the architecture to be really prominent without being the most obvious thing, because it really is the contrast between the foliage, both in value and in mark making, and the architecture, which is what this drawing, I hope, will be all about. It's this contrast that I thought made this potentially an interesting scene to draw. So I'm using larger lines, which also in my hatching, which also I think makes it feel a bit larger, a bit closer. And I'm going darker more quickly because I do want this tree on the right hand side to be darker. So now with a 0.2mm pen, I'm doing this tree that's further back than the right hand one. I thought of it as the center tree as I was drawing it. And using very light and very small marks. So just as the hatching gets larger as the trees come closer, the hatching marks I use for the darker areas of this furthest tree in the front of the church are smaller, which helps give the effect of further away, because things do get smaller as they get further away. It's all about creating visual effects in the marks that we use. And so reducing the size of our marks with distance is a good way of helping to reinforce whichever other ways we're using to create a sense of distance. Even smaller hatching marks. So that further back tree now doesn't look that different to the one on the right, but I do intend with the one on the right to come over it much darker again. Probably I spent 30 minutes on the tree on the right-hand side in the end. Now I'm drawing this freehand in ink, so I didn't have any pencil guide marks. Drawing actual size next to a photo obviously makes it a little bit easier to get proportions correct. But even so, I'm still working hard to draw these trees as they are in the reference photo, because I like the shapes and the balance and the proportions of the trees to each other and to the architecture in this scene, so I want to try and capture that rather than change it. But it also helps me just work out how the architecture is going to sit behind if I keep it as close to things as possible. I actually started, you may remember, with the door of the church, because that was the easiest geometric shape that I could draw, and start then to use as a reference to draw the trees that visually overlapped the door. And then I moved out in all directions from there. So I've now switched to a 0.1mm pen, which I actually don't use very much when I draw. I find it feels too scratchy most of the time. And because I like to have my pen at a slanted angle for various reasons when I draw, with a 0.1 it often means there's hardly any ink going onto the paper. But I do want to get the feeling that this sits way back. And so I'm trying with most of my lines to be careful that I don't actually overlap the lines of the foliage and the church, that there's a slight halo effect created by a very slight white gap. Not enough to be super obvious, but just enough when we look at something to see quite clearly that this is in front of that. So I've drawn something of the cypress pines that are on the other side of the church. Again, I'm going really lightly here. I felt the need to try and do some marks to give a sense of the effect of the terracotta tiled roof, which I think is one of the more difficult subjects that I regularly draw to try and create the effect visually with our marks. I don't want to overdo it, and yet again visually it is a fairly prominent impact when we look at the reference, the tiles, so I feel like I need to give some sense that that's what they are. And now working on some of the values in the architecture, and now I get to the very final tree, which is further away again. It's some distance away from the church. It's not actually in the church grounds. So trying to do a lighter feel with my marks so that it feels further back, not just than the trees in front, but from that other tree on the other side of the church. And a little bit later towards the end, you'll see me just reinforce the emphasis on those cypress pines that are just behind the church on their left-hand side, to just pull them forward a little bit in front of that pine tree. It is further back. So a little work doing some hatching for the shadows on the ground around the base. I'm not trying to get too bogged in detail down there at this stage, and now I come back to this right-hand tree to try and make the whole tree pretty much darker than it is now. So I spent some time doing this, and yet I don't want to make it a real tangle of values. I do want to create a sense of there are forms here that are in shadow, but there are also forms that aren't in as much light as other forms of the tree, of the canopy, of the foliage of this tree. So I need to keep working on that. And I do some more adjustments. Now I go back to the left-hand tree, because having got, in general terms, the value of the right-hand tree, I can now work out just how dark am I going to go so that overall this tree doesn't come across as dark, because it's also in different light. It's got light striking it more directly in the upper right section than the tree on the right, where it's pretty much all in shadow. And you'll see me do a little work at the end, just working on where visually the trees overlap with each other to strengthen the one that I want to come forward or sit further behind. And they're the little adjustments we can do at the end far more effectively. It's better to do it at the end than to try and guess what's going to look best at the end halfway through. So getting the whole drawing established and moving along together at some point is a very important part for the way I draw, to establish not just accuracy of form and shape and so forth, but also of value and of emphasis of where we put the strongest focus in the marks that we use. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you want to have a go drawing this scene and see how you go combining architecture and foliage, particularly when it's the foliage that's the main event, then you'll find this reference photo on my channel community page. So why not have a go? But hey, in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, whatever's the star, whether there's foliage and architecture or not, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.